So in today's video, we are going to cover the concept of repeated boundary violations. And this is because this is a topic I get asked about all the time, where individuals, maybe with a family member, a friendship, a coworker, it can be a parent, one of your children, a sibling, or a romantic partner, or even just somebody you're dating, constantly repeatedly violates your boundaries. And in this experience, there's a few things that we have to do to see like what is going on, how do we get this to stop. So in this video, I'm going to take you through some really important points to be aware of in terms of repeated boundary violations. And at the end, we're going to talk about like the baseline end of story solution that tends to really work for everybody, but that will be at the end. So I'm just going to warn you ahead of time. You're not going to like the beginning of this video, but it's going to make sense if you give it time to sort of unfold here. So the first thing I have to say, and this is because I ran a client practice for quite a long time with tons and tons of clients, is that people come into my office a lot and they would tell me things like, I'll give one example. We'll call this person Molly, who was a client of mine for quite some time. And she came in and she had a historically codependent relationship with her mother. And she said she was going to start communicating boundaries. And as she started to communicate boundaries, these boundaries were getting violated still. And she said, Thais, what do? I don't want to cut off the relationship to my mother, but I'm, having these repeated boundary violations. What's wrong? Does my mother not respect me? Does she not care about my boundaries? And what I found with Molly, and this was seriously an example that I saw with so many people, is that it was actually a communication issue, not a boundary issue. And so, what I learned is that when people are experiencing boundary violations, yes, if there truly are repeated boundary violations, once we get the communication part right, then we may have to set a boundary with the person instead of in the situation. And I'll talk about what that means at the end. But there are a few kind of parts that we have to check off first, because the vast majority of repeated boundary violations I found were actually things, let's say 80, 85% of the time, that could be resolved with proper communication that wasn't being done effectively from the get-go. So we're going to cover these really important communication challenges and some steps. We're going to call it the 5 stops on the train here to check in with our communication so we can improve that first to see if somebody then respects our boundaries more effectively. And if we still don't see that happening once we've improved our communication, at least we position ourselves for a win-win, because then we can move into a more sort of dramatic or drastic path to take in terms of dealing with somebody who's repeatedly violating our boundaries versus, hey, a lot of these things may actually be resolved with simple solutions. Now, I will just say one other thing, quick disclaimer. I'm talking about repeat boundary violations, like people saying things you don't like, people, making mistakes in a relationship that are fairly harmless, but maybe really frustrating or annoying. I'm not talking about like serious boundary violations in this topic, right? If there's a serious boundary violation with somebody where it's something physical, sexual, anything that's harming you in any way, immediately we want to remove ourselves from any kind of context or situation like that. And in that case, we really want to set a really strong boundary and gray rock and get away from somebody who's harming our boundaries over and over again. But if you're in a codependent relationship, you're trying to break out of it, somebody keeps sending you text messages that you don't want to talk about, or somebody, just oversteps in some way, we're going to cover how to really deal with that. Okay. So the first thing is we have to check in. I know nobody likes this part, but we have to check in because this is the thing that is actually in our control, which is if somebody's constantly violating our boundaries, what I would see with individuals time and time again is that they actually just weren't communicating boundaries properly. And if somebody's used to relating to you in a codependent or enmesh way for a very long time, we have to be really good at communicating to break that relationship dynamic out of that pattern. So the first thing I would get people to do is check, number 1, are you communicating clearly? Okay. Number 2, are you communicating specifically? Okay. I'll give you an example here that I use a lot on this channel is if somebody says to you, and this is more about a need than a boundary violation, but if somebody says to you, hey, I really need support in the relationship, they may think that they communicated clearly and specifically. But it's really not that specific. Like for one person, support looks like a hug, and for another person, support looks like taking out the trash. And so we have to really define and like paint a picture of what support looks like to us. So there's no room for confusion, because this is another thing I would see over and over again in my practice. I would see people say, I communicated clearly, I communicated specifically, I told the person I needed support, but support looks different for different individuals according to each of their individual programming, right? So we have to really paint a picture to be very clear and very specific about what we need, or in this case, and on the topic of the video, what boundary is being violated and what we need to happen instead. Okay. So let's just say, for example, that you don't want to talk on the phone late at night. Maybe you like to go to bed early, you like to get away from your phone. If somebody's constantly calling you at night when you're not answering, they're calling and calling more, a boundary violation, or let's say it's a repeated boundary violation, a boundary might be, hey, I appreciate that you want to speak to me and I value our relationship. For me, I have a 10 p.m. cutoff where I do not use my phone. And what I need from you is to try to not call me after 10 p.m., unless there's actually an emergency. If you want to make time to communicate in other places or other times throughout the day, I'm happy to be there. But for me, after 10 p.m., I will not be answering the phone. And, it's not a good time for me to be discussing any of this. So, you want to be really clear, really specific in terms of like the actual boundary that's being violated. And you want to be specific as to what you need to see instead. So if you want to talk, we can talk during the daytime. After 10 p.m., that's it. It can't just be things. And this is where I would see people go wrong, where they'd say, hey, can you not call me a few times in a row? And it's like, what was it about? Was it about calling a few times in a row? If that's just what it was about, say that. If it was also about after 10 p.m., say that too. Make sure you're clear, specific, like really, really clear about what that boundary is. So all the details of it, right? So we need to be clear and specific is really, really important. We can sort of put that in the same category there. The next thing is, as best we can, we want to communicate in real time. So I'd see a lot of people, they wouldn't share a boundary violation. And then a week after the boundary violation happened, in an argument, they'd bring it up. And nobody's hearing you in an argument. Everybody's busy being defensive and trying to defend their point. They're not taking in the information that you're actually saying to them. So if there's a boundary violation, and I know it's kind of like a frivolous example, but if it's like somebody calls you after 10 p.m., if you do answer the phone because and you've communicated this before, you want to say to this person, hey, just as a reminder, I really, unless it's an emergency, don't like to answer the phone after 10 o'clock. So you want to be able to, like, in real time, when the boundary is being violated, be very clear, because it's very confronting and it makes it very obvious, right? That, okay, this is the actual situation. Next stop on the train, okay? You need to communicate in the positive. Again, this is a huge thing. It's such a small thing to communicate, but it makes a massive, massive impact. There's a big difference between saying, you never respect my boundaries, versus, hey, I really need you to respect my boundaries. I've set the boundary here. I've tried to be clear about it. It's after 10 o'clock. So we need to make sure that we're communicating what we do want instead of how the person never does what we want, or about what we don't want, right? So we want to be really, really clear. I need you to respect my boundary. And it looks like making sure that you're mindful about not calling me after 10 p.m. So you're not saying, you never call me after 10, or you never respect my boundary, you always call after 10 p.m. We're not criticizing. We're actually just communicating about what we want to happen instead. So clearly and specifically, in real time, in the positive. Another really important thing that we have to realize when it comes to boundary violations is, if we're doing these things first, okay, we're clear, we're specific, we're communicating in real time, we're communicating in the positive, and we still don't see progress, this is where we can then start to establish consequences, okay? And consequences are not threats. So consequences aren't like, okay, if you call me again after 10 p.m., I'll never speak to you again. Consequences are like, hey, I've mentioned to you a couple times now that I don't like to speak after 10 p.m. And I want to make sure that you really hear me, because I've tried to share this before. I notice that the boundary is being violated. I'm not saying you have malicious intent, but for me, that's a really clear boundary. And if I constantly see that you aren't able to uphold that or be mindful of that boundary in our relationship, it makes me need to pull away and take more space, because I'm not feeling seen and heard, and it doesn't make me want to participate in the relationship more. So we don't say, if you ever call me again after 10 p.m., It's over. I'll never speak to you. We don't do these like dramatic things. We just communicate that there are natural consequences to these sorts of dynamics. Again, it can be something like if you have a family member and they're harsh or critical all the time. You can say, look, like every time there's this harsh criticism, for me, it just makes me want to pull away and protect myself. And I don't want to do that in our relationship. I want us to be able to be in a good spot and grow together. But it's difficult for me. And I want you to know that. So we tell them, you know what, there can be consequences to these actions. Okay. So far, just to recap, we've got be clear and specific. We can kind of put that into one category. Communicate in real time, communicate in the positive. Make sure that you are in a position where you are able to like really clearly state the consequences if somebody continuously violates the boundaries. And then the last part here is if we still don't see success, okay, if we still don't see some kind of growth in the situation, that is going to be where you can say to somebody, you know what? In this case, I have to set boundaries with the person instead of in the situation. So, in this case, the very final stop here is if the person, for example, is calling you after 10 p.m. still, and you've been communicating clearly, specifically in real time, in the positive, and then you've been in a position where you've actually said to the person, like, there will be consequences if you continue to violate this boundary, and you're really clear about that in a non like angry, emotional way. You're just clear, right? Then if you're still seeing these repeated boundary violations, there's nothing left to do. Okay. There's nothing else that's in your wheelhouse to control. It's now about this other person. And if you've done all of those things, this is where you know really clearly you have to set a boundary with the person. So, what I mean by with the person is if that happens, you do take the step back in the relationship, right? If it's somebody being critical, calling many times, whatever your boundary might be that's being violated, you might literally just say, you know what? I've tried to communicate this to you before. I feel like it's just not really reaching you. And because of that, I have to respect myself. And in order to do that, I just have to take a step back from this. And I wish you the best. I'm going to be taking a big step back and, we'll see how things go. So in that case, you may take a big step back, create a lot more space between yourself and that person. And that is where you're going to be able to protect yourself really. Because if somebody's doing these things over and over, and you're doing all the communication work and you're doing your absolute best to try to be understood and seen and heard and confirm with the person and utilize and really leverage all these different forms of communication effectively, then you have to look at it honestly and realize it's probably not just going to be the healthiest relationship for you if you can't work through things and communicate about them. So I hope this is helpful for you. If you do want to do a much deeper dive into boundaries as a whole, I have a whole course all about reprogramming your relationship to your boundaries. It's super effective, super results oriented. For a very limited time, you can check it out for free for 14 days, along with all other courses to PDS. I will put that button for free access in the comment section down below, so you can check that out. And I really want to thank you for stopping by, for being here. If you're enjoying this channel, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and I can't wait to see you in future videos.